Hello everybody and welcome back to another Hail State debate video. It's been a long summer. Very glad you guys are joining us back again for another PF video. I know I'm excited. Obviously, you might tell there's only two people at this table, no Brett, but instead we have a little miniature Brett. Here's Sam Harvey. He's a fantastic debater, a great addition to the MSU debate team. I think he's going to be fantastic on these videos. So thank you for helping out, Sam. Really appreciate that.
And thank you for having me, Devin.
Yeah, sure.
I'm glad to be here.
Of course. For this month, or rather for these next 2 months, September and October, we're going to be debating the resolution, Resolve the United States federal government should substantially expand its surveillance infrastructure along the southern border. So before we get into the rest of this stuff, as always, if this video is helpful, please do like, subscribe, or tell a friend. And as always, sources cited, timestamps, and links to our social media are going to be down in the description below. So before we get into the actual content of the video, let's do what we always do and give some introductory remarks. So since you're new, Sam, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, I'd love to. I didn't do a lot of PF in high school. I did some, and it was fun. So my opinion's not going to be the most fully formed, but I do like this resolution because it's not super lopsided. It doesn't really favor one side over the other. One negative is probably that it's kind of hard to find information that's unbiased. Just don't go to your local congressman in order to do research for this. Dig a little deeper.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. What I have to say is somewhat along the same stuff. I have a little bit more PF experience, so in having that experience, I think this is a pretty good starter topic for those that are new to PF. And if you are new to PF, this is a great video to watch because we're going to try to do basically a crash course of some basic PF stuff throughout the video. But I think it's great for newcomers. I think it's really self-contained, very balanced, and most of your argumentation, I think it's just going to be a lot more fun than some of the previous starter topics we've had in public forum. And I would also agree with Sam. Do not source, like IHateImmigration.com for some of your arguments on the pro, or I despise cameras for some of your stuff on the con. But those are the gist of what we have for introductory remarks. Going forward, as always, it's going to be framework definitions, some background knowledge about the topic, and then we're going to go into some pro arguments and some con arguments. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into that. All right, so let's go ahead and get into some framing definitions and background for this resolution. First of all, let's start off with some definitions. The first definition I want to get into is surveillance infrastructure. So sadly, there's no industry-specific term here that we can use, no industry-specific definition that we would be able to source to actually tell us what surveillance infrastructure is. So we're kind of just left with a fairly open-ended concept. But I think the fair way to interpret this would be somewhere along the lines of adopting newer technology. Obviously, you can't advocate for any specific plans. You can't get up there and tell the judge that by affirming you'll be placing 750 Anduril Sentry systems in a cluster around Eagle Pass. It just doesn't work that way. But the best approach is to have a solid working knowledge of what the current infrastructure looks like and be able to explain that when you affirm, you either get one, the current infrastructure but in greater numbers, or with greater coverage, or some kind of concrete real-world upgrade to the infrastructure that is supported by actual evidence. And we're going to talk about in just a few minutes what current security infrastructure looks like. So for now, just remember the pro's basic story is either more of the same or upgrading what we have. And we'll discuss what that means in a little bit. Now let's move on to the term substantially expand. First is the meaning of substantially. We typically put words like substantially in debate resolutions to prevent clever pro-debaters from sort of, stealing a win through these squirrely, minimalistic advocacies or plans. They can't just get up there and say, well, in order to affirm, all you have to do is add one more drone to the Border Patrol's arsenal. It substantially kind of puts that barrier on that. Substantial is a word where dictionary definitions don't provide a lot of help, though. And so, Webster defines substantial as considerable in quantity, significantly great, and Cambridge Dictionary defines substantially as, quote, to a large degree, but there doesn't appear to be a topic-specific definition. Like, for example, a specific usage of the term substantial increase in, say, a bill about border surveillance or a major study on the subject. So that means you basically just have to apply the test of common sense. What would a normal person consider a substantial increase? Does that mean a 10% increase, a 25% increase, a 50% increase? What exactly would that mean? And in a minute, we'll talk about how our border security budget runs in the billions of dollars annually. And while border security and border surveillance aren't identical, most people would probably assume that to meaningfully move the needle on border enforcement, you'd be looking at something in the neighborhood of hundreds of millions of dollars to billions of dollars in additional annual spending. And given that these are relatively small sums of money in comparison to our $6 trillion federal budget, there doesn't seem to be much incentive for the pro to try to, small ball here with any tiny specific programs. The much smarter move here as the pro is to embrace that big changes are needed to advocate for them.
And speaking of big, now we need to talk about the meaning of expand. Like we said earlier, there seem to be two basic ways to expand U.S. surveillance infrastructure. One is to just add raw numbers of what we already use, and the other is to advocate generally for adding upgraded technology, with the understanding that you probably cannot specify very specific tools or technologies, as that starts to look like a plan, which, as we all know, isn't really allowed in PF.
Right.
But you certainly can point to sources that suggest real-world policymakers are considering certain tools or technologies or even locations in order to basically say, if we affirm, this is the kind of real-world change that we're really likely to see. And with that, we have most of the definitions that are going to be important to this round and to your understanding of the topic, so it's best to move on to framing from here. In regards to framing, I think that this resolution is fairly straightforward. There's a pretty basic conflict in this resolution between very pragmatic goals of efficiency on the border and more abstract concepts like human rights. If you're the AF, you'll probably be focused on the former, and if you're con, the latter. With that said, we should point out for those that are new to the activity that even if a certain side tilts towards talking about things in the abstract, things like human rights or privacy or racial bias, you should still be trying to quantify those concepts as best you can. Quantifying your impacts leads to a better argumentation and more forceful impacts in the round, and that really is what PF is about.
So, if you're on the con and you have something that says that these systems are going to violate the rights of immigrants or those that live in the United States, this resolution kind of pushes you into the corner as the con for advocating for these kind of abstract concepts or saying that they've been violated. So the best thing for you to do is not say, okay, I'm going to abandon these because there's no real data there, but try to find something that says that X number of people have had their privacy violated on the border or things like that. That's the best way to get up in front of a judge and tell them this kind of story so they can understand the scale. But now that we know the framing, I'm going to go ahead and move into the background. So in sticking with the theme of the more information, the better, let's talk a little more precisely about what surveillance infrastructure at the border actually looks like in the status quo. So before we can expand our infrastructure, we need to know what infrastructure we have. The surveillance capabilities of the United States Border Patrol are really quite varied. They operate a number of large drones, small drones, portable scope trucks, whatever that means. I'm really not quite sure. AI-powered camera towers and much more. There's a very comprehensive electronic Frontiers Foundation piece that we'll link to, which goes through the United States Border Patrol's arsenal system by system, and that will be in the description. But if we're going to go look specifically, let's start with some of the systems they have, which might begin with
towers. So let's briefly talk about some of the capabilities that the U.S. Border Patrol has. For starters, let's talk about the poster boy of surveillance systems, the Anduril Sentry Tower. ASTs, previously known as Innovative Surveillance Towers, typically refer to the Sentry Tower systems developed by Anduril Industries. These 33-foot tall solar-powered towers are connected to artificial intelligence software that analyzes footage and controls the cameras. Because the systems are linked, the algorithm has the ability to track objects from tower to tower. ASTs are relocatable. They can be packed up and transferred to another location within a few hours. This tower has been a staple at the border, consistently being purchased and planted at the border in large numbers since the Trump administration. Maybe this is because they look cool, but probably it's because the tower's advanced AI capabilities, which we'll talk about more later on in the video. Even though this is the main system, there is still a grab bag of other towers being employed all across the border. Specifically, the Electric Frontiers Foundation talks about in July 2024 how many towers are in use, saying that as of July 15, 2024, the map and data set has grown to 479 towers. The main takeaway here is that these towers are increasing in number and ability. The technology deployed at the border is always being upgraded and increased. So just keep this in mind when you're thinking about what expansion might really look like.
So besides towers, there's also drones that are being used on the border. And the interesting thing about the United States Border Patrol's drone program is that it is both old and new. It's old in the way that way back when, around 2006, the Department of Homeland Security bought several Predator drones and leased this out to the United States Border Patrol to use on its operations on the southern border. This, to say the least, was a terrible decision. This short excerpt from a report by the Cato Institute should help illustrate just how downright bad this was. They say, quote, each Predator B drone costs $17 million to purchase and $12,000 roughly per flight hour to operate. Thus, CBP's drone program cost a grand total of $255 million from 2013 to 2016. And in that 3-year span, this is not in that quote, but in that 3-year span, later on in the article, they point out that this drone program only apprehended 7,000 people. Out of the millions of people that were apprehended by the Border Patrol, only 7,000 of those were caught by this humongously expensive program. But even though these drones are still in use, it is getting better. The United States Border Patrol has since revamped its drone program, shifting to smaller, less demanding drones. Since around 2018 or so, this small drone program has really taken off, if you will. According to Unmanned Systems, they say, quote, in a summary of current small drone operations and capabilities that, quote, CBP's small UAS or unmanned aeronautic systems program has grown to average 28% of CBP's direct air support hours flown, and accounts for 48% of air-assisted apprehension events. So basically, these smaller drones, the ones that you do actually see used by YouTube vloggers or whatever, you know what I'm talking about, they are being used in larger share every single time the Border Patrol operates. The U.S. Border Patrol does get good use of these drones, but in total, their utility pales in comparison to the towers that have been deployed. There are less drones and they require far more manpower than these towers demand. So understandably, the United States Border Patrol has been more reluctant to spend millions on this drone program than the tower program, as you don't have to train hundreds of employees every time you buy a batch of towers. According to Federal News Network, they say in an article, quote, operating more than 330 systems, it plans to grow to more than 500 assets and continues to train and hire operators in 2024. And that was talking about the Border Patrol's current arsenal of drones that they have. But it's important to note that these smaller drones seem to be shifting the landscape of drone operations. As drones have become more advanced, smaller, cheaper, etc., they have started to form the backbone of this kind of virtual border. Once again, you don't have to know the exact systems that are being implemented at the border, but you just need to know that drones have started to be implemented and continually added to the wheelhouse of border enforcement.
But the wheelhouse does go beyond some of those bigger things like drones and towers. There are some fairly odd tools that Border Patrol has used on the border. I don't foresee a lot of teams really talking about these, spending really any much time on these. They aren't very common, but it's still good to know. First, the most important is port of entry, or POE, surveillance technology. This would include things like license plate readers, certain kinds of sensor technologies. I wouldn't personally spend a lot of time on this, as basically every port of entry has this technology. Expansion wouldn't mean much for port of entries. Secondly, USBP, or US Border Patrol, operates a number of literal blimps that fly across the border to keep watch. They have about 4 of these things, and you'd be hard-pressed to find much information about them outside of the EFF report that we mentioned earlier. Again, not really something to spend a lot of your time on in round.
Right, and we could go on endlessly about, how many systems there are that are being deployed by the U.S. Border Patrol that have nothing to do with actual operations. I mean, they have a Boston's Mechanics robot dog that they deploy sometimes. So I wouldn't get caught in the weeds trying to figure out exactly what's on the border and then bring that up and round. I just have a general understanding of what these guys have and how they use them. So, but now that we do know what exactly is on the border, you might be asking yourself, so where exactly are these surveillance capabilities? Well, the EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, has a fantastic graphic on where exactly all of these systems are, which we'll show on the screen. Now, if you look hard enough, you will definitely notice that there are some major gaps, hundreds of miles long, between some systems and others. That's mainly because when a tower goes up, it really isn't deployed on its own in the middle of nowhere. Rather, U.S. Border Patrol places these towers in clusters, mainly along populated areas in the United States or right across from major cities in Mexico. So even if hundreds of towers have been deployed in the past couple of years, that doesn't mean that much progress has really been made in terms of actual surface area on the border. We may need thousands of these towers to actually cover the entire length of the border, and we may not need towers. U.S. Border Patrol may deploy drones over larger, more rural areas because of the fact that there would be more land to cover. Who knows? But ultimately, there's still ground to cover. And, well, because of that, now you might be asking yourself,
how do we expand? Now would be a good time to look at examples of what expansion would actually look like. If you've researched this topic for more than 10 minutes, you might understand that things are a little murky on this front. For example, you may have seen articles attacking or maybe supporting expansion, and specifically Biden's plan to bolster funding for border digitalization efforts. So let's start here. The articles that we're talking about are going to be referring to is Biden's proposed 2021 Citizenship Act. The White House described the language pertaining to surveillance technology as such. It authorizes the Department of Homeland Security Secretary to develop and implement a strategy to manage and secure the southern border between ports of entry that focuses on flexible solutions and technologies that expand the ability to detect illicit activity, evaluate the effectiveness of border security operations, and be easily relocated and broken out by border patrol sector. What the very vague text there actually translates to is something along the lines of, we're going to buy more towers and drones. However, that bill failed.
So what has happened since that bill failed? Well, even though that particular bill did fail, the Department of Homeland Security still receives a very large budget. And the truth is, expansion is always ongoing. The United States Border Patrol is always buying new equipment, retooling, and slowly moving in the direction of phasing out manned patrols in favor of highfalutin surveillance systems. The Electronic Frontier Foundation says as much in this report on the expansion of border surveillance infrastructure in March of 2023, saying, quote, "Meanwhile, CBP is in the process of installing 200 autonomous surveillance towers from Anduril Industries that are controlled by artificial intelligence software, which will also be part of the IST program." That's another program that we'll talk about later on in the video. In the short term, CBP has earmarked $204 million for this program in its 2023 and 2024 budgets, which covers the deployment of 74 ASTs by the end of fiscal year 2024 and 100 new towers by the end of fiscal year 2025. My goodness, been a long day.
Yeah.
Since the bill failed, millions of dollars have still been funneled into expanding our surveillance capabilities, albeit at a much slower pace. So as a further point on how to understand substantially expand, you should see current expansion as a benchmark. In order to substantially expand, we're looking at billions of dollars instead of millions. And this money would probably have to be specially provided and outside of the normal budget for DHS. We would really be looking back to the kind of expansion that the Citizenship Act was proposing. So I think that this sets up a pretty good foundation for what we're going to talk about later on in the video with the other arguments. So in that case, why not we just cut to the chase? Let's go ahead and get right to them.
All right, so here's where we jump into the arguments on the pro, and since Devin, you did most, if not all, of the writing on this, I think we'll let you take the reins while I will sit back and be the snarky commentator.
Sounds good. The first one I want to start off with is southern border security is a good thing. The basic foundational argument for any AF case is that that a secure southern border is generally a good thing. The impacts of really any other argument, making it cheaper to enforce our border, making border enforcement more efficient or effective, etc., hinge on the assumption that it is good to make border enforcement easier, better, and cheaper. Without getting into the fiery political rhetoric, southern border security is good and necessary. And rather than thinking that it is antagonistic to immigration, really the best way for this argument and for any AF to understand sort of the border is as a spigot of immigration. Safe and secure borders allow us to make sensible decisions regarding the amount of immigrants that we allow into our country. We can make these decisions based on our terms while still allowing anyone from anywhere to achieve their American dream. This control allows us to vet immigrants to make sure they pose no threat to our country or our citizens, and it allows us not to overwhelm aspects of our economy. So like I said, think of it as a spigot. You can turn the water on or turn the water off, and you can control the level of immigration that comes through the country. Without this spigot, our country is inundated with millions of people and people whom we know nothing about. As we'll discuss later, good data is hard to find, but all of the evidence we do have points to the southern border undergoing one of the worst migrant crises that our nation has ever faced. This is according to Statista, a chart showing, and it is a chart showing the number of apprehensions and expulsions by U.S. Border Patrol from 1990 to 2023. This was published in February 2024. We'll put it on the screen. What this chart shows us is that the U.S. Border Patrol encounters at the southern border have ballooned to roughly 2.5 million a year. The important part of this chart isn't so much the number of encounters, but the general trend. The U.S. Border Patrol is quite forthcoming about its inability to catch all of those who attempt to cross the border, and if the encounters have skyrocketed, gotaways have likewise likely followed. This is according to the U.S. Border Patrol, and it's an estimate of total non-apprehended border crossers on the southern border in 2022. They say, quote, despite the relatively high number of encounters in 2021, improvements in CBP's estimated at the border apprehension rate, which averaged 78% in 2018 to 2020, compared to 35% in 2002 to 2004, kept the estimated number of entries without inspection far below the levels observed in the early 2000s. Based on preliminary data, DHS estimates that about 660,000 border crossers evaded apprehension in 2021.
Something that I'd like to say is that 78%, there's a little more independent research that you can do, but it's only 78% that are properly documented, with an even lower percentage being actually caught and usably litigated against.
Right. And so the appropriate question to ask ourselves in this instance is, what happens when there aren't any controls on how many people are allowed to immigrate to the United States and on who is allowed to immigrate to the United States? Well, for one, our economy is overwhelmed. Without a border and all of the appropriate technological systems and surveillance infrastructure that necessarily should come along with it, many millions of people can immigrate into the United States unabated. This means increased pressure on supply in our economy. Most importantly, it means extreme pressure on goods that cannot be easily manufactured and are not prone to swift market trends. Namely, surging immigration drastically and disproportionately inflates housing prices. This is a study done by Rosa Sanchez Garner, and it's a study on the effects of immigration rate on housing prices published in May of 2023. And they say, quote, I find a 1 percentage point increases in the immigration rate raises average house sale prices by 3.3%. And when it becomes much more difficult for Americans to own homes, wealth accrual, social mobility, and financial stability vanish along with the prospect of home ownership. Turner and Luea talk about this in a study they published, talking about how home ownership is essential to wealth increases for Americans. They say, quote, accounting for the skewed nature of wealth distribution, we find that each additional year of home ownership increases total net wealth by $13,700 on average for the full sample of the study. But unfettered immigration from the southern border does not only cause economic headaches. It also poses a safety issue. With millions of immigrants who have been unable to pass through the southern border without having undergone a thorough vetting process, many immigrants with criminal records are bound to have slipped into the United States. And we should be clear, we're not intending to fearmonger with this argument whatsoever, and neither should you when you're in round. But without a proper vetting system, it should be clear to everybody that bad apples are bound to fall into the barrel. The United States Border Patrol shows in this chart displaying the trend of criminal non-citizen encounters at the border that number has risen along with every other crossing on the border. And we'll show this chart on the screen. As you can see, from fiscal year 2021 all the way to now, that number of people who have been caught at the border with criminal records has continually increased just along with every other crossing. And the general trend of criminals attempting to cross the border has followed the general trends of every other attempt. Even though this demographic makes up a tiny proportion of those who've attempted to cross the southern border, and for those who've been successful, the results have still been disastrous. Hannah Davis, writing on the demographics of federal arrest data from 2018 in June of 2023, says, quote, a 2021 Department of Justice report revealed that 64% of federal arrests in 2018 involved non-citizens, despite comprising only 7% of the population at that time. So basically what this argument comes down to is that when we don't have a reasonable amount of control at the southern border, it impacts the financial well-being and personal security of Americans. Outside of enforcing the law, it is extremely important to be able to enforce borders specifically because it wards off these chaotic effects. So any other argument forwarded on the behalf of expanding surveillance infrastructure has this one as a justification. So let's move on to the second argument, better for everything. The basic idea behind this argument is that the kind of technology available to us today would not just aid Border Patrol. It would fundamentally change it. We're not just talking about your grandpa's surveillance towers here. These new towers, drones, sensors, etc., whatever you want, could and would all take the place of human patrol agents, saving lives and billions of dollars in tax money. Thankfully, we aren't the only ones saying this. Back when Biden was attempting to get his Citizenship Act through Congress in 2021, this is what Political's Jay Weston Phippen had to say. They say in 2021, quote, on his first day in office, President Biden released his U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021 bill. Tucked between reforms for asylum, for visas, for the DREAM Act, was the section titled Deploying Smart Technology at the Southern Border. It would not only save money by reducing the number of agents needed to patrol the 2,000 miles of unforgiving terrain, it would also save lives. With a smart wall, migrants who found themselves lost in the deserts and mountains along the border would be spotted, captured, and safely deported. Since this article was written, Biden's bill failed, like we talked about earlier. It's very sad for the act, but he's been nothing but vindicated by the continued development and implementation of this technology. Ahmadian, Lim, Kim, and Tora Beji say in a study, quote, in February 2022, quote, specifically, in response to tough environmental factors posed within national border areas, drones can facilitate border monitoring by simultaneously allowing fewer agent deployments and maintaining counter-intrusion detection. Drones can fill the gaps in current border surveillance systems by 1, improving coverage along remote sections, 2, providing real-time information to the control operator for quicker responses, and 3, reducing the risk of agent endangerment. And these technologies wouldn't just guide agents towards the action or save us all a little bit of money, they would also help knock out some kinks in the wiring. The DHS says in 2021 in a report that, quote, for example, agents from the Rio Grande City Border Patrol Station in Texas spent up to 30 minutes traveling to investigate sensor alerts because no RVSS camera was in place, as planned, to provide video surveillance of a certain area. Similarly, agents from the Brownfield Border Patrol Station in California routinely traveled 45 minutes or more to investigate sensor alerts in vulnerable border areas where no video surveillance capability existed. The impact here, though hard to quantify, would be a major increase in efficiency at the border. Expanding this infrastructure means saving money, saving time, and saving lives, and a ton of inconvenience in places where this technology should be, but it isn't. From the bird's eye view, this also means just having better systems in place. These systems can do what 100 agents couldn't do. Expanding surveillance capabilities means a newer, better border. And so that leads us to our fourth argument, which is it quells human and drug trafficking. Well, making a better border is great, but what exactly does that translate to? For one, human trafficking. According to Hannah Davis, talking about how human trafficking is surging at the border in June of 2023, she writes, human trafficking increased massively in the last fiscal year. Arrests rose 50%, convictions soared by 80%. The vast majority, 72% of those trafficked in the United States are immigrants. Most of them are here illegally.
And this is just another way that you as the pro can stop being so data-driven, so harsh, make yourself a little more sentimental, appeal to the judge.
Right, and that stuff is extremely needed in this round, especially for what Khan's got coming up. But Hannah Davis continues, saying, quote, many are women and children who are highly vulnerable to being smuggled and eventually trafficked. A study from the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women estimated that 60% of unaccompanied alien children, or UACs, are caught by cartels and exploited through child pornography and drug trafficking. She says, quote, to put this into perspective, more than 150,000 UACs crossed into our country last year. So that's tens of thousands of people that are falling into human trafficking every year. And failings at the border have fueled this gruesome industry with tens of thousands of people each year. With the advancements that surveillance technology would bring, thousands of people could be saved from any number of the ills associated with this. But there's another problem. Drug overdoses have been mounting nearly every year since 2015. This is due to the rise in prevalence of fentanyl within the United States that has been trafficked from Mexico across the southern border into our country.
And something that you want to remember is that the majority of those doing the trafficking are U.S. citizens. So that's something that you want to let inform your case.
Right, but not if you're the pro. So according to the National Institute of Drug Abuse, they say overall, fentanyl death or drug overdose deaths rose substantially from 2015 to 2022. Deaths involving the synthetic opioid fentanyl in 2015 was just under 9,000 compared to 2021. The number skyrocketed to 74,000 overdose deaths in 2021, though, and you can see this on the chart that we're putting on the screen now. As you can see in the graph, the sheer amount of fatalities is just staggering. And just like with human trafficking, if we see a way we can solve this by expanding surveillance infrastructure on the border, then we should. Well, we can. An overwhelming majority of the fentanyl that finds its way into the United States comes across the southern border. And this is according to Christian Pinochet Paul, and he writes that a vast majority of fentanyl smuggled into the United States comes from the southern border. He writes this in October of 2023. Quote, most of the fentanyl seized by the two agencies in fiscal year 2023, about 98.9% was seized at the southern border. So by expanding surveillance capabilities with proven track records and immense potential, we can save thousands of people from the ills of human trafficking and save thousands of lives from the potency of fentanyl. So lastly, let's move into our fifth argument, which is spotty surveillance is deadly. I think this is sort of your right hook argument, right? Most teams, both your AFs and your NEGs, would agree that some level of surveillance should exist at the border. Even if they don't agree, it's not a hard case to make. Surveillance makes border enforcement better in basically every regard, so most of your disputes will be about expansion. NEGs will probably argue that we should wait for more comprehensive regulation on biometric data, or that these technologies need to be further tailored or restricted in some manner, and obviously we'll see some of that later.
Oh, you betcha.
Right. But here's the deal. Surveillance capabilities on the southern border are an all-or-nothing proposition. Selectively deploying this technology in only some of the hottest spots for illegal passage along the border effectively reroutes travel, as opposed to stopping it. And this travel then becomes extremely dangerous. Chambers, Boyce, and Lanius write about how concentrated surveillance infrastructure directly correlates to increased migrants' deaths in 2019, saying, quote, findings show that there is a significant correlation between the location of border surveillance technology, the routes taken by migrants, and the locations of recovered human remains in the southern Arizona desert. And what this study was basically saying is that once we put, these systems in, say, San Diego or in these really, really populated areas, migrants would instead leave the urban route. They wouldn't try to go through San Diego or try to go through Eagle Pass, Texas, where there's a lot of surveillance. They would try to go through these extremely dangerous, barren routes in the desert. And a lot of them would sadly pass away on that journey. So this is not on a micro scale either. This doesn't only affect Arizona. The entire border is structured this way. Highly populated areas get preference with the hope that immigrants will be deterred by tougher terrains elsewhere. And the problem is, according to the Electronic Frontier Foundation, they say on how new and current towers are concentrated in high population areas, March 2023, that, quote, in July of 2020, CBP announced plans to acquire 200 of these towers by the end of fiscal year 2022. I'm talking about Anduril here. A deal worth $250 million. These towers are heavily concentrated in Southern California, with patches popping up in southern New Mexico in the Big Bend, Laredo, and Del Rio Border Patrol sectors in Texas. They continue to say that, quote, a large number of the existing and planned targets are positioned within densely populated urban areas. The truth is, the only truly deterrent border policy is one that isn't just selectively deterrent. Old theories about this off-limits terrain stuff has proven to be complete bunk and at the cost of fueling human trafficking and killing thousands of migrants. The Guardian, writing about the amount of immigrants whose remains were recovered by U.S. Border Patrol in 2023, wrote, quote, critics say, however, that the prevention through deterrence strategy pursued by several administrations has driven migration through deserts and mountains, leading thousands of migrants to die or go missing. The remains of nearly 10,000 migrants have been found by the Border Patrol in the last 25 years. And Timothy Dunn, writing for the NACLA on the increase in human trafficking due to selective deterrence in 2016, says, quote, "The border buildup did have a host of negative consequences for migrants, many of which have impacted border communities. One of the most obvious was that it pushed unauthorized crossings out of urban areas, like San Diego and El Paso, where the vast majority of such crossings had long taken place, to non-traditional rural crossing areas that are much more dangerous, particularly in the Sonoran Desert of southern Arizona. In response, unauthorized migrants almost universally turned to using coyotes, smugglers, up to 100% usage from 70% previously. And the cost of such guides increased by a factor of 5. So the cost doesn't matter. But the point here is that instead of going through these urban areas, people went through extremely dangerous routes, and they turned themselves over to human smugglers to do so. So when we selectively deploy these capabilities, thousands die and millions fall into the hands of human traffickers. We can spare these effects if surveillance capabilities aren't deployed at all, surely, but then we'd have to hire more agents, spend more money, and risk more lives for even worse results. But as we've shown in all of our other arguments, surveillance is a necessary component of a safe, secure border. So if we deploy these systems at all, we have to be responsible. We have to expand our capabilities. So that's the AF. Let's go ahead and get into the con. All right, so now the con arguments. And just like last time, as you may know, I wrote the pro arguments, and so that means that Sam wrote the con. So if you will, Sam, take the lead on the con, and I will also be a very snarky commentator along the way.
All right, thank you very much, Devin. I wanted to say right off the bat, before getting into any specifics, a lot of the best con arguments are going to rest on the assertion that something more specific and fleshed out than something so vague as expanded surveillance infrastructure needs to happen. Which is why I remind you that in the most recent edition of the NSDA Unified Handbook, it stated verbatim, neither the pro or con side is permitted to offer a plan or counterplan. So don't let any of your opponents tell the judge this'll happen or that'll happen. They don't get to decide, and for that matter, neither do you. So now I want to jump right into the first major point I want to talk about, which is that expanded border surveillance harms U.S. citizens. All right, so this argument could be anything from one subpoint to the focus of your entire case. That's going to be true for all of these arguments. Regardless, one of the best things that either side can do is make the debate about something more than just undocumented migrants or illegal immigration, as those themselves are divisive partisan issues. So now we're going to jump right into trying to do just that. I want to talk about how border surveillance violates American citizens' privacy. An article by the Reason Foundation on border surveillance via the virtual wall from March 2023 talks about the virtual wall has a lot of problems that other border technologies and tactics do. It's been expensive, broadly expanded the surveillance abilities of unaccountable government agencies, and more dollars are being spent, more migrants are dying, and more civil liberties violations are occurring. That was a quote. The real important parts there are unaccountable government agencies and civil liberties violations. The bulk of this virtual wall is composed of surveillance towers. Those are the kind of towers that Devin and I have been talking about for the entire video. Towers that can track and scan everything in an, at most, 7.5 mile radius, although a lot of them are a lot smaller than that. And the reason why that's important is because when we have these towers that are, and this is something that we haven't discussed yet, capable of tracking pretty much all motion, all movement, all of the things that happen in the radiance that they can surveil, expanding that radiance, making more of them, right? That means that the unaccountable government agencies can see the American citizens that fall into these radiuses too. And we know that this is absolutely the kind of thing that Customs and Border Patrol would take advantage of when we talk about the 100-mile border enforcement zone. And this is from an article by the American Civil Liberties Union in August of all the way back in 2014 that says, quote, federal regulations give U.S. Customs and Border Protection authority to operate within 100 miles of any U.S. external boundary. In this 100-mile zone, Border Patrol agents have certain additional authorities. For instance, Border Patrol can operate immigration checks. What ends up happening in many cases is Customs and Border Patrol officials, whether they are allowed to or not because of the power they feel from their expanded authority, conduct warrantless searches of private property and private land, saying that they're looking for immigrants. What happens when we expand the surveillance tower infrastructure is it becomes a heck of a lot easier for these Customs and Border Patrol officers to look at people on our side of the fence, our side of the wall. And so it's a privacy violation. And I know that's a little bit hard to quantify, which is something that we had been talking about, but don't worry, this would only be one of your many impacts. If we want to talk about something quantifiable, we can move to talking about how borders hurt the economy. Now, this is still under the tighter borders, more secure borders hurt U.S. citizens. So we'll talk about what The Hill says in February of 2024, this year, about immigration and the economy, saying that the vast majority of population growth that we have in the United States right now is from immigration, and that is a key reason why our labor force has grown in the last couple of years, and if it continues, it will be a key reason why our labor force continues to grow. Basically, what this article is telling you is that immigration causes growth, not just of the labor force, but as it continues to go on and talk about its growth of the GDP, its growth of tax revenue for the government. So in simple terms, tighter borders means less immigration. Less immigration means less economic growth, and any source from Investopedia to the IMF will tell you that's bad, mostly because of an increase in unemployment.
Right, and the simple argument here on the con is whenever you're talking to your judge, don't try to sell them on, we have to have it. I mean, what you're trying to sell them on is a really simple story, which is in order to have business growth, you have to have people work for those businesses. And the best way that we can compete on a global scale with other countries that are beating us economically, like China, is bring in millions of people that are willing and able to get into the workforce.
So now that we understand that, now we understand kind of the economic and privacy harms to Americans, I want to move on to how Customs and Border Patrol is incompetent. And to anybody here who is a child or a member of Customs and Border Patrol, I'm sorry, but they're not doing a good job. The gist of this argument would be that it doesn't matter how much we expand surveillance if we don't change the way that we think about the southern border. This argument is pretty multifaceted, so there are going to be a lot of ways that you can break it down. I'm just going to be talking about some of the more standard approaches, one of which is that expansion has no effect. You guys were all expecting this. If you came in doing any research at all, you were probably expecting we would talk about how we can't, there is no point of expanding surveillance. It's not going to do anything. Well, at least in my eyes, I'm sure Devin disagrees because he's the pro.
Right.
You'd be right. So we'll talk about an article by MIT Tech Review from April 2023 about how the U.S. funding surveillance technology at the southern border doesn't really do much. They quote the Director of Investigations at Electric Frontier Foundation, Dave, I think it's pronounced Maas, and that's just another thing. The Electric Frontier Foundation is a great source. You should go and read them as much as you can.
Absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, but they say, I have never heard a very well articulated explanation of what the goal is. Is the goal to deter people from crossing the border? Is it to document people crossing the border? Is it to intercept people crossing the border? And this is kind of going to be a big theme on the con, which is that this is a directionless resolution. What we've been talking about a lot is just examples of ways that the border surveillance has been expanded. But what we haven't been talking about is kind of a unified effort, a unified goal, and that's because there really isn't one. And so that's the kind of way to think about this. The way to explain it in round is to say you can't win a race if you're running in circles. You can't build muscle if every time you go to the gym, instead of just lifting weights, you're juggling the 1-pound dumbbells, right? You can't get anywhere if you don't know where you're going. What I'm about to say next is actually both the warrant and the impact. So for those of you who are new, whenever you're making an argument, you have the claim, which is what you're saying is true. You have the warrant, which is what proves it. That's the evidence. And then the impact, which is the real world ramifications. So the American Immigration Council in August of this year, so this month, well, I don't really mean to date the video that we're making here, but we are in August, The cost of immigration enforcement is what they're talking about. And they say, since the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, in 2003, the federal government has spent an estimated $409 billion on the agencies that carry out immigration enforcement and tens of billions more on border barriers and other immigration enforcement-related infrastructure projects. Now, I'm going to be giving you two more sources, both of which are Pew Research Center. From 2011, about immigration from 2000, this is illegal immigration from 2000 to 2010, and we're going to put the graphic that's here up, and you can see that in the year 2003, all 3 years before it had lower immigration than 2003, and all of the years after 2003 had higher immigration. Now, we're going to give a little leeway to DHS because they were just getting started, but to see a noticeable increase is always a bad sign, even if you're just getting started. And then the next one from Pew Research Center, this is from February of this year, 2024, about record immigration in late 2023. They say, quote, the U.S. Border Patrol has had nearly 250,000 encounters with migrants crossing into the United States from Mexico in December alone of 2023. According to government statistics, that was the highest monthly total on record, easily eclipsing the previous peak of about 224,000 encounters in May of 2022. And this comes at a time when President Biden has been reluctantly increasing security and surveillance at the border. So what we're seeing is not just that we can't correlate an increase in funding, an increase in surveillance to anything at all, but that we can correlate it to an increase in illegal immigration, right? And so that's kind of the gist of the argument. You're not really getting any bang for your buck. Now we want to talk about harms to migrants. When we were talking about the pro, you might have heard me chime in a bunch about wanting to talk about the migrants, about the harms to them. This is where on the con, you get the opportunity to do that. Let me make this very clear as we're going into this, though. You don't have to or need to argue that illegal immigration should be easier, or even that any kind of immigration should necessarily be easier. You don't have to argue that the United States should grant asylum to everyone who asks for it. All you have to do is argue that when the U.S. federal government tries to make the border just aimlessly more secure, it results in migrant deaths that could easily have been prevented. The reason I say this is because a lot of the reason that some people join speech and debate and then quit is because they're not a big fan of arguing the side that they don't necessarily believe in. So remember, you only have to argue some really technical stuff here. And so let's jump in. Talking about how technology on the border increases discrimination. So this is from Just Security on Racism at the Border from June of 2024, where they say that CBP-1, a mobile AI application implemented by the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol, to submit personal and biometric information to apply for asylum. This app has come under scrutiny, including because it is less able to recognize the photos of black and dark-skinned people, which I know is a little ironic coming from the two of us. But that creates a barrier for them to access this portal to move their asylum applications forward. Now, we as the public don't actually have access to the particular algorithm that CBP-1 uses, but similar facial recognition technology has been largely rejected as racially discriminatory in other contexts such as policing. The UN Human Rights Council, that's a big source, I love using them, in June of 2020, on racial discrimination by technology says that algorithms like the one that CBP-1 uses have been found to misidentify black faces up to 100 times more often than white faces. The exact range is between 10 and 100 times more often. The real reason why this matters in the context of the argument is that the same government that this resolution would have substantially expand surveillance infrastructure, when it attempted to expand surveillance infrastructure, imposed racist and just generally flawed systems that made the process as a whole less efficient and more biased. This goes back to that overarching goal of we need something more specific. This resolution is aimless, right? So at the end of the day, what you say is CBP-1 and projects like it promote racism. It's that simple. Now we want to talk about hazards at the border. And so before I get into this, this is actually going to be pretty similar to the last major point that Devin talked about, but in the context of the con. And so this is, again, for those of you who are kind of new, major difference between some arguments for the con and the pro is just how you frame them. And this is a great example of that. And Devin and I didn't even coordinate this, but it's just going to be a great thing for you to learn. So we'll start with Now, I know you might be thinking, why is it a bad thing that our borders are too secure? And that's kind of going back to what Devin said, that we want our borders to be really secure, right? Well, there are two answers to that. When we have the kind of clustered surveillance that Devin was talking about, they aren't secure. And secondly, because we are deterring people, we're doing a good job with these towers, with these systems, of deterring people, sending them to more dangerous places. An article by Coda Story from July of 2021 on the lethality of surveillance says, quote, a 2019 peer-reviewed study by researchers from the University of Arizona and Earlham College showed that the surveillance matrix along the Arizona border, this includes towers, ground sensors, etc., made it so migrants had to use more dangerous routes in the desert, exposing them to greater risk of dehydration and heat exposure. And so now you're probably wondering, where does this differ from what Devin said? So it's basically this kind of idea that if we make it harder to cross the border safely, migrants will just put themselves at risk. The difference is that we as the con say, yes, absolutely, look at what has happened to expand infrastructure in the past and see that every time it's happened, we've been putting clusters of towers of information of systems at these densely populated areas, at these places where we don't need more surveillance. But we have nothing in the past to tell us that they would go anywhere other than where they are least effective and most lethal. The International Organization for Migration, in an article from September 2023, talks about deaths at the border, saying, quote, the International Organization for Migration, the IOM, documented 686 deaths and disappearances of migrants on the U.S.-Mexico border in 2022 alone, making it the deadliest land route for migrants worldwide on record. That's the kind of thing that's going to be an impact. When you talk about that, you want to say deadliest land route, because that's what it is. And that's only because of the way that the United States has been expanding surveillance in the past. Kind of the turn to this argument would be that if we expand our surveillance to cover the hazardous areas, then migrants wouldn't die, we would have a secure border, and all of that great stuff would happen. And that's really what Devin was talking about in his point. And this is actually the big difference. You as the con then have to take it upon yourself to make it the pro's responsibility to prove that the entire border can and would feasibly be covered. Because remember, when we prioritize, and the U.S. federal government has prioritized putting these towers at these densely trafficked areas first, that means we have to have the resources to put them everywhere, and that the United States federal government would feasibly recognize that. This is where the lack of plans and counterplans really comes to help the con. The impact here is that you sell the judge on the numbers of deaths. You actually might want to go back and look at Devin's article about the thousands of bodies that were recovered, because that's an even better number to use than the 686 deaths. With that, we're going to move to the fourth big point here, which is that Customs and Border Patrol is having big personnel issues. Now, I know this one seems totally far-fetched. I mean, who wouldn't want to work at the United States southern border, getting to meet all sorts of new and interesting people? How is it possible? How is it possible that people would give up arguably the best job in the world? I promise I'm going to stop hammering on this, but
if he's sold it, they're still hiring, I'm sure. So
you're always hiring,
yeah.
$83,000 a year. But I digress. We want to talk about first the decline in workers that have worked for CBP in the past. And the article we want to reference here is from the Institute for Defense and Government Advancement, saying that Customs and Border Patrol worker retention is absolutely abysmal. This is from 2024, and they say, quote, according to the Department of Homeland Security, the number of Border Patrol agents was on a steady decline from 2020 to 2022, a time at which encounters at the border were skyrocketing. So when we needed the most, kind of like the Avatar, they vanished. So it's no surprise that workers would start leaving when the work gets drastically more and gets more difficult. Working for Customs and Border Patrol comes with a non-fixed workload. So kind of you respond to what's happening, to the trends that are happening. And a lot of the time, the other conditions that exist lead people to leave this job, because it's not exactly the most fun job in the first place. And now we can talk about what the American Federation of Government Employees from January in 2018 says about working conditions at the border, because we kind of need to understand that. And they cited several reasons for the staffing struggles, including low morale, punishing work conditions, and inequitable wages. Basically, The biggest problem at the border is high work and as a comparison, low pay. I know I said $83,000 a year, but that's kind of on average, and trust me, it's really not enough for what they do. We don't give enough appreciation to the good Customs and Border Patrol workers. I hate to have to make that kind of distinction. And now we want to talk about, because I said good workers, and that implies bad workers, unqualified candidates. Another big personnel issue for Customs and Border Patrol is finding qualified candidates, since not just anyone can be trusted to handle one of the most important borders in the world. And so we look to the Brookings Institute, which talks about how the border crisis isn't going away. In February of this year, they say, the difficulties in hiring led former INS Commissioner Doris Meissner to estimate that approximately 27 candidates are needed to hire one Border Patrol officer. And there's more quote, but I want to skip down to where it says that Border Patrol agent positions are required to take a polygraph, but data shows that 65% of applicants fail the polygraph test. So it's all really bad, and I'm not going to come back to the polygraph test thing. That's the kind of thing that you're going to want to look into. I want to talk about the 27 candidates. So when Customs and Border Patrol says about themselves in April of this year that they currently have about 60,000 employees, that means that U.S. Customs and Border Patrol is one of the largest law enforcement organizations. So Devin, I want to ask you, what would you say is a good number for a substantially increased amount of work and thus amount of workers to increase by?
I don't know.
Well, that's fair. Actually,
Yeah.
The fact that it's nebulous is something that we're trying to hammer home.
Yeah.
So I'll go with a really conservative 10% estimate, right? Because that's kind of the lowest that you'll see somebody say for substantially increased. For a 10% increase in employment, 6,000 workers, there would need to be 162,000 applicants that just don't exist. So what we have as the impact here is that we already have a decreasing number of Customs and Border Patrol workers, right? And we're not able to replace them. So by increasing their workload, which has historically driven them away, we not only can't increase our surveillance capacity, but might also end up decreasing it. So making the effort to expand might very well be the downfall of U.S. Customs and Border Patrol as a whole. And then the final thing that I want to talk about with the personnel issues is that, yeah, I know I said that we need 162,000 people to hire 6,000 candidates, but that's qualified candidates. Remember, the government isn't just going to accept, oh, we can't get this done. What they're going to do is they're going to lower their standards. And one of the worst ways that the Customs and Border Patrol lowers their standards, and it's also one of the first, is by hiring racist personnel. The American Immigration Council in February of 2021 talks about racism at the border and says that a culture of racism within the Border Patrol has persisted throughout its history. Repeated reports have surfaced of agents using racial slurs, sexual comments, and other offensive language. Agents have maintained connections to the white supremacist movement, and the paramilitary SWAT-style Border Patrol tactical unit has been deployed to crack down on protests of police brutality against black people. All right, this kind of incompetence was the big reason that standards were raised in the first place. But what we see if we try and take on some massive expansion of surveillance infrastructure is that we'd have to hire people, and that wouldn't work. So we would have to hire people who aren't necessarily qualified for the job. And so that's the big impact there. You know, we get unqualified people or decreased border surveillance.
All right. Well, sounds like that's it for Con. So we'll be back with some final thoughts right now.
All right, some final things to think about whenever you're prepping for and debating this resolution is a lot of what we've tried to do here is give you the really basic information, the stuff that you need to know to learn more. On the pro, really what you need to do is make sure that you're not coming off as a jerk. And on the con, and I've tried my best to give you a lot of that, but you want to be able to quantify those emotional and ideological harms that you're talking about when expanding surveillance. And I know that can be tough, but this is the start of your journey for this particular topic and perhaps for PF as a whole. So I hope that it goes well for you, and just remember, work hard.
Yeah, like Sam said, this is presumably the start of a lot of people's PF careers. And for that very reason alone, I say just try to have as much fun with it as possible. I think we've given you more than enough analysis on the topic than for me to go ahead and start giving you more and more, just sound like a broken record. But what I would say at the end of this is just try to have fun and don't make this any worse than it really has to be. This is a really good topic, and my advice in that sense is don't make this a political topic. Don't get up there and start saying these crazy things about immigration, or sort of treat everything that your opponent says about immigration as something that's crazy if they're being very reasonable and simple about this stuff. Try not to make this some sort of fiery, heated debate round. Just go in there and have fun with this topic, and I tell you, I think that you will enjoy it because of how contained and simple it is. You're probably not going to have any tricks played on you or anything like that. So now that our final thoughts are out of the way, I just want to say thank you guys so much for coming back and watching another one of these videos and having us go through this topic with you. As always, debate is for everybody. Work hard, have fun, and hail
Hail
State.
State.